Greetings, friends of liberty. Sometimes, I must confess, on those rare occasions when Marguerite hangs so excessively on my sword arm, I disentangle her hand and, giving her my regards, take off to the club. They're luxuriating amongst those of the male sex who understand the need not to be smothered. Often, if my predilection turns to jousting, I can and do engage in swordplay with any number of combatants there. But if my taste for the day runs more to the intellectual, then given that Edward Gibbon and many other historians, both budding and accomplished, are members, we can engage in verbal historical fisticuffs on any number of issues. Not a week passed, both of us bowing first to Clio, the muse of history. Edward and I engaged in a lively exchange concerning who started that most famous of ancient wars, the Peloponnesian, betwixt, as you no doubt know, ancient Athens and Sparta. I, on this occasion, argued, along with Thucydides, that the previous decades-long expansion of the Athenian Empire was the intermediate cause for the Spartans starting the war, because they feared the Athenians would become even more powerful if not stopped. It was now or never. Gibbon, on the other hand, argued, strangely enough, that firstly, Athens was weaker than at times previously and thus presented less of a threat to Sparta, so why would Sparta attack? Secondly, that Athens and Corinth hated each other so much more than Athens and Sparta, and thirdly, that Corinth forced Sparta's hand by threatening to secede from the League, and thus Corinth was the true instigator. In response, I enlightened Edward that, firstly, while it's true that Athens was weaker in 431 than in 460, she was much stronger than she was in 445 BC, she increasing her power from 444 to 431 much in the same way that she had from 470 to 460. Take note, Edward. Secondly, regarding the rivalry with Corinth, Gibbon relied on the father of history, Herodotus, but here Herodotus in part was mistaken in ascribing Corinthian enmity to Athens, since, for example, in 445, they had concluded an amicable treaty, but later in 440, Corinth had to a degree taken Athens' part at the council in Sparta. Thirdly, the speech of Sthenelatus, threatening Sparta with Corinth's secession from the Peloponnesian League, was likely just a rhetorical device, no serious threat. Gibbon had no real answer to all my rejoinders, which surprised me to no end, and left me feeling quite pleased, I must say. Now, if we turn to the issue of who is to blame for wars, your own 20th century on the European mainland, we encounter today the sublime work of Annika Mombauer, German transplant to England, lecturer at England's Open University, and apparent protege of John Royal, himself a premier World War I historian. In Origins of the First World War, Controversies and Consensus, Mombauer in superlative fashion describes both the intellectual battles fought amongst historians over its causes and the causes themselves. She begins with a brief mention of the central incubus of blame lying heavily over World War I studies, quoting British historian George Gooch, who said, "It is part of the tragedy of the World War that every belligerent can make out a case entirely convincing for itself." And so they have. But is then the blame to be apportioned equally? Returning to the prehistory of World War I, she tells us how German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was desirous to avoid, not start, conflicts with other nations, since he wanted to keep the German nation he had assembled out of its constituent parts together. For this reason, his complicated alliance system served to ensure that what he considered a nightmare of coalitions against Germany could not threaten the new status quo. But with Kaiser Wilhelm II's accession to the throne in 1888, everything changed. First, the Kaiser chucked Bismarck from the bus of his chancellorship after 2 years in 1890, and then, following the nationalist and statist ideas prevalent in German universities and the country, and absorbed by him throughout his youth, began to position Germany for European and even world dominance. Thus, as the years progressed, Kaiser Wilhelm's nationalistic Germany, started a massive naval armaments program under Grand Admiral Tirpitz, head of the German Imperial Naval Office. The English rationally understood such a program as an increasing threat and responded, partially by creating the revolutionary dreadnought class of battleships. B, the Germans attempted to gain a British commitment to neutrality should Germany attack either Russia or France, or allies. C, Germany was angered that France and England had concluded a treaty over Morocco where, although Germany had few commercial interests, it felt slighted by not having been consulted. Germany desired to split or loosen the Anglo-French alliance, the so-called Entente Cordiale, but instead drove them closer together. D, Balkan instability was obviously a threat to world peace, with the issue of nationalism and national determination coming to the fore, with Russia supporting the Serbs and Austria wanting to hold its empire together, opposing Serbian desires for a nation. Germany, Austria's ally, unconditionally supported it, and war was only avoided in 1908 because of Russia backing down. In 1913, with Russian support, Serbia doubled its size in the Second Balkan War. E, the Germans, pushing it yet again, created a second Moroccan crisis in 1911, when they attempted to bully the French by sending a gunboat to Agadir, and then wanted the French Congo in compensation. By this, they had convinced everyone they were now truly the bully boy of Europe. F. Then, in July 1914, came the assassination by Serbian nationalists in complicity with the Serbian regime of Archduke Ferdinand. G. Furthermore, Germany then infamously gave its blank check to Austria, its ally, to do whatever it wanted to Serbia, with the Kaiser insisting that such action must not be delayed and that it would be regrettable if the opportunity were not seized. Many German officials were willing and even eager to go to the brink, they having been encouraged to do so by Germany's leading military advisors, who had advocated war the sooner the better on many occasions and had assured the politicians that Germany stood a good chance of defeating its enemies. While some historians charge then British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey as instrumental in causing the war by not being clear about the actions Britain would take in the event of German aggression, Mombauer argues that his hesitant attitude was motivated by the desire to avoid an escalation of the crisis, since Grey feared that a definite promise of support might have led France or Russia to accept the risk of war more willingly. German and Austro-Hungarian decisions, on the other hand, were based on the explicit desire to provoke a conflict, not to avoid it, as in Grey's case. German ambassador to England, Lichnowsky, said, "On our side, nothing, absolute nothing, was done to preserve the peace. And when we at last decided to do what I had advocated from the first, it was too late. By then, Russia, as a result of our harsh attitude, had lost all confidence and mobilized." As Mombauer stresses, denial of aggression was sought after by every major power, since their populations were much less approving of initiating aggression. Germany's official machinery of government, therefore, went into overdrive to manufacture excuses for its behavior under the Kaiser, and published its findings in a white book already in August of 1914. The subtitle, "How Russia and Her Ruler Betrayed Germany's Confidence and Thereby Made the European War." A few Germans resisted the official propaganda effort. A, the renegade law professor Kantorowicz, who called it the most falsified color book of the war. B, the socialist Karl Liebknecht. C, the German ambassador to England, Lichnowsky, aforementioned. And D, a few others in Germany who started suspecting the truth. The German White Book was a huge and ongoing cover-up. By contrast, the populations of France and Britain generally understood that Germany had been the aggressor. In France, partly because French forces had deliberately been positioned 10 kilometers behind the border, precisely to avoid an accidental initiation. In summary, the populations of France, Britain, and America rightly had been convinced that Germany had been guilty of starting the war, that it had encouraged Austria-Hungary to pursue its bellicose policy vis-à-vis Serbia, that it had refused mediation proposals designed to defuse the situation, and that it had wanted war to realize its own expansionist aims. From the beginning, the German government regarded the Treaty of Versailles as a grave injustice. I would say that at one point, at least, the famous Article 231 forcing German admission of war guilt was counterproductive. In this famous Article 231, the Germans were made to say, as part of the treaty, that they were responsible for the war. This, again, although totally true, was highly counterproductive psychologically because it threatened Germany with a continuation of hostilities unless it said something it didn't believe. Again, although true, that's coercing agreement from a whole nation, who will invariably resent it. Mombauer adds, allocating war guilt in this way was unprecedented. Prior to the First World War, the question of guilt had never really featured in connection with wars. After the war, the official disinformation effort that started with the German White Book continued from June 1919 through the Third Reich. Key elements of the German bureaucracy mounted a massive and successful campaign that purveyed false propaganda through a wide range of channels. The German Innocence Campaign was directed by the German Foreign Office, which established a powerful propaganda organization for this very purpose, the War Guilt Section, in 1919. In addition, they started the propagandistic Center for the Study of the Causes of the War and also the Working Committee of German Associations. At times, many volumes of official documents were simply suppressed or not included in scholarly editions, since the documents were so incriminating for German policy prior to the outbreak of the war. Nonetheless, some of the very men who spread this propaganda in private admitted that their own actions had been at the root of the origin of the conflict. Ms. Mombauer here adds Germany's intentions behind the official document publications to put foreign governments on the defensive, as well as changing international opinion in its favor, seem to have been largely achieved. The amount of reparations the German nation was initially expected to repay, of course, was enormous. The unimaginable sum of 269 billion gold marks over 42 years, a sum that was reduced in May 1921 to 132 billion, an almost equally fantastic sum. This too stoked German anger and resentment. During the interwar years, various American and British revisionist historians and pacifist intellectuals blamed the Allies for the war. Among these were the American H.E. Barnes, also a Holocaust denier, Senator Robert Owen, claiming the Allies had greatly deceived the people of the United States, and English journalist E.D. Morel, who said, German militarism is a bogey of the heated fancy. French militarism is reality and sets its iron heel on Europe. All this revisionism led to greater American feelings of isolationism, and in England to a decreasing desire to enforce all the terms of the treaty, whether good or bad. But there were still a few who said the truth even in Germany, with the aforementioned German law professor Hermann Kantorowicz saying that the whole guilt propaganda, meaning the attempt to evade guilt, is nothing but an incredible deception of the people which amounts to a moral mobilization for the next world war. In effect, historically, Kantorowicz called it in 1930, predicting World War II 9 years before it began. Not surprisingly, his report about the true causes of World War I was suppressed by the government. By the 1950s, the interwar orthodoxy of the European nations having slithered into the First World War was still a popular point of view, while it was commonly argued that Hitler had been a mere alteration. At the first West German historians' national meeting since the war in 1950, the eminent historian Gerhard Ritter emphasized the victory of Germany's main theses in the international historians' debate of the 1920s. As far as Germany's historians were concerned, the debate on the origins of the First World War was over. Enter German historian Fritz Fischer, who, with his 1961 publication of Germany's aims in the First World War, exploded the whole standard consensus and thus much of German historiography and German national self-understanding. Fischer's apple cart upsetting breakthroughs, already foreshadowed in Italy by Luigi Albertini and in England by historian A.G.P. Taylor, shattered conventional falsities by arguing that A, the German leadership had pursued an aggressive foreign policy in the years before 1914, B, had regarded the July crisis as a golden opportunity to achieve some of their expansionist aims, and C, that the German War Aims program was supported by all political parties, including the majority SPD, moderate industrialists, virtually all German academics, and in all the German states. Not only did Fischer rescue German historiography by erasing the almost half-century of collected falsehoods and state-subsidized propaganda, but to a degree, the soul of Germany itself, since all understood that someone in Germany had the courage to turn against the establishment and to ask the continuity question. That being, was World War II really just a historical continuation of World War I? As one German student said, we followed Fischer particularly because he provoked the staid older men to a fury. Fischer's 1961 work, the result of extensive archival research, uncovered, for example, the September program, which outlined German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg's war aims in the initial phase of World War I in 1914 when Germany was winning. These set forth a significant revision of the national borders of Europe itself, with annexations galore, a customs union that would guarantee German economic hegemony, and a German colonial empire in Africa. As Fischer himself wrote, the realization of this program would have brought about a complete revolution in the political and economic power relationship in Europe. Although the Americans and British were sympathetic to him, Fischer was opposed by significant elements of German society, by the president of the West German Bundestag, Eugen Gerstenmaier, by Franz Josef Strauss of the Bavarian CSU, by historian Michael Freund, who complained that nobody is served if one smears the entire German history with Hitler's dirt, and above all, again, by Gerhard Ritter, one of Germany's most famous historians. But, as Mombauer says, what Fischer's critics failed to see was that, arguably, the suppression of the truth about Germany's role prior to 1914 and the unwillingness of successive Weimar governments to come to terms with Germany's past had made the coming to power of National Socialism possible in the first place. This is what invariably happens when governments interfere with and subsidize the study of history. The next work by Fischer, his 1969 War of Illusions, argued that the decision to go to the war had actually been decided in December of 1912, Fischer utilizing the very diary of the Kaiser's chief of the Imperial Naval Cabinet, Admiral von Müller. According to Müller's account, the Kaiser envisaged the following at the December 8th meeting, the Kaiser saying, Austria must deal energetically with the Serbs, otherwise she will lose control of the Slavs and the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. If Russia supports the Serbs, then war would be unavoidable for us too. We could hope, however, to have Bulgaria and Romania and also Albania and perhaps also Turkey on our side. If these powers join Austria, then we shall be free to fight the war with full fury against France. The fleet must naturally prepare itself for war against England. General von Moltke, Army Chief of Staff, added, I believe a war is unavoidable and the sooner the better, but we ought to do more through the press to prepare the popularity of a war against Russia. His Majesty supported this and told the State Secretary, Admiral von Tirpitz, to use his press contacts to work in this direction. Tirpitz made the observation that the Navy would prefer to postpone the great fight for 1.5 years. Fischer used this evidence and much more besides to argue that the decision to go to war had been largely made in December 1912. Further work, such as by British historian John Röhl, later buttressed Fischer's argument in numerous points. In summary, Fischer argued that the preventative war of 1914 was an attempt to defeat the enemy powers before they became too strong and to realize Germany's political ambitions, which may be summed up as German hegemony over Europe, just like Adolf's ambitions. The subsequent discovery of another diary, that of Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg's secretary, Riesler, added even more drama. In the end, however, its publication proved disappointing due to numerous crucial gaps in the passages, with some pages cut out. The suspicion was raised that some more incriminating material had been removed either by Riesler himself or by someone else after his death. Ms. Mombauer devotes her final chapters to assessing the present state of the debate, arguing that A, some German historians emphasize the subtle influence that domestic politics had on changing the imperial foreign policy goals, B, how others argue of the relative importance of what other countries intended, with Austria-Hungary's role at the start of World War I strongly scrutinized, C, that others, such as Niall Ferguson, repeated British Prime Minister Lloyd George's claim that the war was the fault of then British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey, with Mombauer disagreeing for numerous reasons, and D, how blaming France for the start of the war doesn't work, since although it wanted Alsace-Lorraine back, it was never aggressive about that, while Germany's aggressive intentions were long clear. In conclusion, this is a magnificent book, deserving of an A, and perfectly suited for any college wanting to give an in-depth analysis both of the causes of the war and its historiography, in just over 200 pages. Ms. Mombauer's lifelong engagement with the subject and her ability to discern who the bad actors were and are serves her in good stead. Happy for my part that we British have hardly been responsible for starting any wars at all, but truly excelling once they've been started. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.